Hi, I'm Joanne Wickmans. Through the magic of text-to-speech, I bring this podcast to life, diving into complex topics and presenting them in an accessible format. Expect a journey across a vast array of subjects. Welcome aboard, and I hope you enjoy the ride.
So, I want you to imagine waking up tomorrow morning, grabbing your phone to check the overnight news, and seeing that the global price of crude oil has spiked 20%.
Which is just a staggering number to even process.
Right. It's not, steadily creeping up over a tense month of negotiations. We're talking overnight.
Right.
You pull up your brokerage app, and the indices are just, they're a sea of red. The global financial markets are in an absolute free fall, and trading halts are triggering across major exchanges.
Absolute panic.
Exactly. And then you see the catalyst. The Strait of Hormuz is completely shut down.
The main artery.
The artery that handles a massive percentage of the world's liquid energy just severed. A historically unprecedented event. And the headlines are confirming that the United States and Israel are engaged in a sprawling, multi-front Gulf war against Iran.
Yeah, that is the exact scenario we are unpacking today.
Welcome to our deep dive. I'm incredibly glad you're here with us because our mission today really requires us to navigate some exceptionally dense and, frankly, volatile territory.
Very volatile.
We are going to map out a highly provocative geopolitical analysis drawn from a recent extensive interview featuring the Dutch entrepreneur, author, and financial analyst Willem Middelkoop.
Right, and he lays out a unified theory of how the current global financial structure is buckling and how that economic desperation is translating directly into kinetic military action.
But before we dive into the actual mechanics of this, we really need to set some firm ground rules for our discussion today.
That is absolutely essential to establish right up front. The source material we're examining makes some intense, highly politically charged claims.
Extremely.
It offers these sweeping assessments of global leaders, makes very specific and controversial claims about the motivations of the current U.S. administration, specifically framing this within the context of Trump's second term, and makes similarly intense claims about the leadership in Israel, Iran, and China.
Right.
We are dealing with raw geopolitical theory here, touching on deep-seated religious and political motivations.
I want to be entirely clear with you, the listener. Our goal with this deep dive is not to take a side.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we here to debunk or validate the political rhetoric contained in the source. Our job is strictly to act as your guides through this framework.
We are essentially treating Middelkoop's text as a map of a highly specific worldview.
Exactly. Whether you find yourself agreeing with his conclusions or vehemently rejecting his premises, understanding the architecture of his argument is crucial. We want to see how he connects the dots between a looming sovereign debt crisis and a kinetic war in the Middle East.
And to lay the foundation for those connections, we really have to look at the macro lens our source uses. The analysis is built on two overarching frameworks, the Big Reset and the Fourth Turning.
The Fourth Turning.
Right. Middelkoop argues that we aren't just looking at a standard cycle of geopolitical tension, but rather the messy, chaotic unraveling of the entire post-World War II order.
Which is a huge claim.
It is. He relies heavily on the Strauss-Howe generational theory, that's the Fourth Turning, which posits that history moves in roughly 80-year cycles. And these culminate in a period of institutional destruction and societal crisis before a new order can actually be born.
So think about the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, and World War II.
Exactly. And according to the source, we are currently at the absolute apex of the current 80-year cycles crisis phase.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we're at the apex of a fourth turning, the inciting incident Middelkoop points to is that complete shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
And we've heard threats about the strait closing for decades.
Yeah.
It was a constant specter during the tanker war in the 1980s, but it never fully materialized.
Oh, no.
The source, however, treats this closure as an inevitability driven by a fundamental shift in how Washington operates. He draws a massive distinction between the first Trump administration and the current iteration.
It's a profound structural difference in his view. When analyzing the first term, the source notes that despite the unconventional rhetoric and the aggressive posture on trade, the administration ultimately operated within the established guardrails of the international system.
Right, because of who was in the room.
Exactly. The argument is that the executive branch was heavily populated by the traditional political and military elite. There was high turnover, yes, but those traditional institutional players provided friction.
They were the adults in the room, so to speak.
They acted as a buffer against the more radical policy impulses.
I hear that argument, but looking back at that first term, it certainly didn't feel bound by traditional rules to the people actually living through it.
Yeah.
So how exactly does the source define this shift to Trump 2.0 to justify calling it a complete rupture?
Well, the source argues that the friction is just gone. He describes the current executive operation less like a traditional American administration and more like a mafia club.
A mafia club.
And he uses that term very specifically to denote an executive branch that no longer views itself as bound by the normative rules of international law or traditional diplomacy.
Interesting.
Instead, it relies on overt extortion and is highly motivated by domestic political vengeance. The key difference is the cabinet composition. The source points out that the administration is now staffed entirely by loyalists. You no longer have the pushback from the institutional military or diplomatic corps.
Which really brings up the psychological analysis mentioned in the text. The source leans into this idea of a psychopathic form of narcissism at the top, which is then amplified in a closed loop by yes men.
Right, it becomes an echo chamber.
If you are a leader who demands total victory and you surround yourself with people who absolutely refuse to tell you when an idea is catastrophically flawed, your reality becomes incredibly distorted.
Completely detached from reality.
The text claims this specific psychological environment is exactly what gave birth to the belief that the U.S. could execute regime change in Iran purely through an air campaign without ever deploying ground forces.
Which is just an astonishing strategic delusion when you actually look at military history.
Yeah.
The belief that you can force the capitulation of a massive, heavily fortified, technologically capable nation like Iran strictly from the air, it ignores decades of strategic doctrine.
Right, it's never worked.
But the source argues that when the leadership demands a clean, casualty-free victory to sell domestically, the yes men in the cabinet will architect a plan to deliver that illusion, regardless of the tactical reality on the ground.
And for you listening, this is where high-level geopolitical theory crashes directly into your everyday reality. When the established rules of the global superpower game are discarded, the friction burns down the entire supply chain.
It affects everything.
It dictates the premiums on global shipping insurance, which dictates the cost of manufacturing in Asia, which directly dictates the price you pay for basic consumer goods. When Washington decides that the post-WWII diplomatic guardrails are obsolete, the volatility instantly prices itself into your cost of living.
That volatility isn't just a byproduct of unconventional leadership, though. The source argues it is being actively fueled by a potent new ideological framework within the cabinet itself.
It's deeper than just policy.
Much deeper. We aren't just dealing with transactional America First isolationism anymore. The analysis points to a deeply religious, crusader-like mentality taking root in the Pentagon.
Yeah. Let's look at the Secretary of Defense, or, as the source pointedly relabels the position, the Minister of War.
Right.
The text focuses heavily on Pete Hegseth. Initially, you might look at his appointment as standard political theater, bringing in a television personality to wage a domestic culture war against so-called woke policies in the military.
Which is the surface-level read.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the source digs much deeper into Hegseth's personal ideology.
The analysis highlights his physical presentation, specifically noting the Crusader-era tattoos. And the source doesn't view this as a casual aesthetic choice. In this analytical framework, those symbols are indicators of a profound, zealous religious worldview that fundamentally alters the Pentagon's calculus. We are looking at the injection of theological imperatives into the command structure of the world's most powerful military.
And how does that domestic theological imperative map onto the Middle East?
Yeah.
Because the source makes a direct connection between this faction in the U.S. cabinet and religious extremists in Israel.
Yes.
Claiming they share a highly volatile, specific objective, the rebuilding of the Third Temple in Jerusalem.
This is where the geopolitical stakes become truly existential. The construction of the Third Temple on the Temple Mount is a theological endgame for certain fundamentalist factions.
Right.
But the geographic reality is that doing so would require the demolition or at least the profound desecration of the Al-Aqsa compound, which is one of the most sacred sites in the Islamic world.
Which is a red line.
A massive one. The source argues that this shared theological ambition completely rewrites the rules of engagement in the region.
Because it removes the concept of rational deterrence. If I am dealing with a rational state actor whose goal is resource acquisition or border security, we can negotiate. We can use economic sanctions or the threat of kinetic force to alter their cost-benefit analysis. But if an actor believes they're operating on a divine mandate to fulfill a theological prophecy, how do you deter that?
You can't. That is the God complex the source identifies. Traditional, mutually assured destruction relies on the assumption that both sides actually want to survive.
Right.
When you introduce apocalyptic theological goals into the war room, self-preservation is no longer the primary driver. It makes these state actors incredibly unpredictable. And the source argues that this religious fanaticism is the accelerant that turned a tense geopolitical standoff into an active, uncontrollable conflict.
And this is a massive pivot in the source's argument. While that religious zealotry provides the ideological fuel and the willingness to escalate, Middlecoop insists it is not the root cause.
No, it's almost secondary.
The ideological crusade is almost a smokescreen for a much more mundane yet far more systemic crisis. The true driver of all this chaos is the balance sheet.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the core of Middlecoop's thesis. The underlying disease isn't theological, it's macroeconomic. The United States has reached the mathematical limit of its financial architecture.
The debt.
The source points to the national debt, which is rapidly approaching the $40 trillion mark.
40 trillion. It's a number so vast that human brains really struggle to contextualize it. It's not just a big mortgage. It fundamentally alters how a sovereign state operates.
Exactly. When you are looking at $40 trillion in sovereign debt, the interest payments alone begin to eclipse the entire defense budget.
Wow.
The traditional mechanism for managing this, issuing treasury bonds and relying on foreign central banks to absorb that debt, has stalled out. The world is saturated with U.S. paper, and the appetite to fund American deficits is waning. The source argues that the administration looked at this mathematical certainty and realized the old system was dead. They could no longer print their way out of the deficit without triggering hyperinflation, and they couldn't cut spending enough without causing a domestic depression.
So, facing this $40 trillion black hole, what is the administration's move? The source says they threw a joker card on the table.
The joker card.
And that joker card was extreme, weaponized tariffs.
Historically, tariffs are used selectively to protect nascent domestic industries or to punish specific trade violations. But the source describes the administration's use of tariffs as a desperate revenue generation play.
Just to get cash.
Exactly. They believed they could plug the gaping hole in the budget by taxing the entire global supply chain. The text mentions the various band-aids they attempted, bringing in private sector figures like Elon Musk to audit and slash federal spending, even briefly floating the idea of utilizing a strategic Bitcoin reserve or re-auditing the gold reserves to recapitalize the system.
But those are just accounting tricks in the face of a structural collapse. The real existential threat to the U.S. financial system, according to the text, comes from the outside. It's the BRICS alliance.
You're right. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, alongside all their new inductees. The U.S. administration is watching the BRICS bloc actively architect an alternative global financial system.
Outside the dollar.
Completely. They are developing mechanisms like Enbridge to bypass the SWIFT network, and they are increasingly settling bilateral trade in their own local currencies rather than the U.S. dollar.
And if the global South stops utilizing the dollar for cross-border trade and energy settlements, the U.S. loses its exorbitant privilege.
It's game over.
It can no longer export its inflation, and the demand for that $40 trillion in treasury debt collapses. It is an existential threat to American economic hegemony.
Which triggers an incredibly aggressive response. The source details how the administration moved from standard trade disputes to outright financial warfare.
Drawing a line in the sand.
They issued an ultimatum to the global South. Any nation that joins the BRICS alternative systems or attempts to settle trade outside the dollar framework faces punitive tariffs ranging from 100 to 150%.
150%. That's essentially an embargo.
It is overt extortion designed to force the world to remain shackled to the dollar system.
And this leads to a foundational quote from the interview. The source says, the U.S. won't go down without a fight.
Right.
Faced with a multipolar world where the dollar is no longer the undisputed king, Washington hasn't opted for a managed decline or a graceful restructuring of the global order. Instead, they've chosen what the source calls the flight forward.
The flight forward is a fascinating concept here. It describes a phenomenon where an entity facing inevitable collapse decides to aggressively accelerate its most destructive behaviors rather than retreat.
Doubling down.
Exactly. The source argues that the U.S. is using its remaining military and financial supremacy to violently enforce compliance. They are willing to blow up the global trading system rather than lose control of it.
Which brings us back to the kinetic military actions. Because when we look at the targets of American aggression in the scenario of Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, it seems disjointed at first. But the source provides a massive aha moment here.
The real target.
The U.S. isn't attempting regime change in Caracas or Tehran just because they dislike the leadership. These are proxy targets.
The ultimate target in this grand strategic game is China. The source posits that Washington views Beijing as the singular, credible threat to its global hegemony in the 21st century.
Right.
But initiating a direct kinetic conflict with a nuclear-armed peer competitor like China in the South China Sea, that's too high risk even for this administration.
But hang on, targeting China by blowing up the Middle East seems like an incredibly convoluted bank shot. Why not just pressure China economically directly? We've seen tech embargoes and semiconductor bans. Why escalate to a physical war with Iran to hurt China?
Because of the geography of energy, China is an industrial juggernaut, but it has a glaring strategic vulnerability. It is massively reliant on imported energy to fuel its manufacturing base and its military machine.
And where's all that energy coming from?
The vast majority of that cheap, reliable oil is flowing from Russia, Venezuela, and crucially, Iran.
So the strategy is a geopolitical siege. You don't attack the castle walls directly. You poison the wells outside the castle.
Precisely.
The source maps out a dark, highly pragmatic strategy where the U.S. targets China's friends. You execute a regime change in Venezuela, which the text claims the CIA essentially achieved by buying off the upper echelons of the military leadership to cut off that oil supply.
Right.
You squeeze Cuba to secure the hemisphere, and then flush without perceived success, you move on the biggest target.
The final piece.
The ultimate goal of the Gulf War isn't just about Israeli security or theological prophecies. It's about severing the energy artery that feeds the Chinese industrial engine.
It's a strategy of total resource starvation. But the source contrasts this aggressive, kinetic U.S. strategy with how China is operating globally. And there's a deeply resonant quote in the text from an unnamed African minister that perfectly encapsulates the shifting soft power dynamic.
I found that quote to be the most memorable part of the entire analysis.
It's brilliant.
The minister says, "When a Chinese ambassador visits, I get a new airport. When an American ambassador visits, I get a sermon."
It perfectly distills the failure of current U.S. diplomacy. China is playing a highly pragmatic, multi-generational game. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, they are laying down physical infrastructure, ports, rail lines, telecommunications across the global south.
The tangible things?
Yes, they are creating deep, sticky economic dependencies without attaching overt ideological mandates. They don't care about the domestic political structure of the host country as long as the resources flow and the debt is serviced.
Meanwhile, the U.S. approach, as described by the source, relies on moral grandstanding, backed by the threat of financial ruin. The sermons are demands for ideological alignment or democratic reforms. And if a country refuses, the U.S. deploys sanctions, tariffs, or military intervention. The text argues that the U.S. is rapidly bleeding moral authority. The global South is exhausted by the hypocrisy of being lectured on human rights by a nation that is simultaneously weaponizing the global financial system and bombing sovereign nations. They want the airport. They don't want the sermon.
And this over-reliance on coercion and military threat brings us to a catastrophic miscalculation in the administration's plan regarding Iran.
The air war.
The source points out that the executive branch didn't walk into this blind. They actively ignored their own intelligence apparatus. The text claims that both the CIA and the Pentagon explicitly warned the cabinet against initiating an air war regime change strategy against Tehran.
If the Pentagon, the actual people tasked with executing this war, knew it was a disastrous idea, how did it happen? We discussed the yes men dynamic earlier, but surely the Joint Chiefs presented the tactical reality of what fighting Iran actually entails.
They did. The source notes that the modern intelligence community possesses highly sophisticated modeling. They, along with allied intelligence networks like Mossad, had an accurate read on Iran's capabilities.
They knew the risks.
The intelligence assessment was that Iran is not a fragile, hollow state that will collapse under a bombing campaign. They have spent generations hardening their infrastructure and developing a specific military doctrine to counter American air and naval supremacy.
Right.
The experts said this is a massive underestimation of the adversary. But the political leadership, demanding a swift victory, overruled the tactical assessments.
And the reality of that underestimation is what brings us to the asymmetric warfare playing out in the Gulf. When the U.S. strikes, Iran doesn't respond symmetrically. They don't scramble a fleet of outdated fighter jets to challenge F-35s in a dogfight.
No, that would be suicide.
They use the advantages of a weaker power to exploit the structural vulnerabilities of a superpower.
The specific execution of this asymmetric strategy, as detailed in the text, is devastating. The source alleges that Iranian forces, utilizing swarm tactics with cheap, highly maneuverable drones and precision-guided ballistic missiles, have systematically dismantled the U.S. military infrastructure in the region.
Just overwhelmed it.
We are talking about billion-dollar, state-of-the-art, early warning radar stations in Bahrain being completely overwhelmed and destroyed.
This brings up a crucial supply chain failure highlighted in the analysis.
Yeah.
It's not just that the radar is gone. It's that the U.S. has effectively depleted its stockpile of Patriot missile interceptors.
Yes.
And this isn't a problem you can solve by simply throwing money at it.
Exactly. This exposes the atrophy of the Western defense industrial base. The cost asymmetry is just brutal. You have a $20,000 Iranian drone being intercepted by a $4 million Patriot missile.
Which is unsustainable.
The U.S. can afford the financial cost, but they cannot afford the time it takes to replace the physical asset. Producing a Patriot missile requires a highly complex supply chain, specifically regarding solid rocket motors and advanced guidance systems.
You can't just flip a switch and make more.
The lead time is measured in years, not weeks. The source claims the U.S. essentially fired off its finite inventory, and the domestic production capacity is entirely insufficient to replenish the theater in real time. The billion-dollar shield was shattered by a million-dollar swarm.
It renders the entire U.S. forward operating presence in the Gulf incredibly vulnerable. It's a glass cannon scenario. But the source introduces a variable that pushes this from a regional tactical failure to a global existential crisis.
The escalation.
If the U.S., desperate to salvage the operation, decides to push the escalation ladder even higher, the text notes that Iran possesses heavy radioactive material. The threat of a dirty bomb enters the calculus.
The inclusion of a radiological threat in the source's analysis illustrates the extreme danger of pushing an adversary into a corner where survival is at stake. A dirty bomb wouldn't necessarily destroy a city kinetically.
Right, it's not a nuclear weapon in the traditional sense.
But the radiological contamination would render massive swaths of territory or critical waterways uninhabitable and impassable for decades. It shows that when you abandon deterrence, you open the door to apocalyptic contingencies.
And while Washington and Tehran play this high-stakes game of chicken, the collateral damage is falling on the surrounding region. The source forces us to look at the unintended consequences for the Gulf states.
This is a huge piece of the puzzle.
Imagine living in Dubai as this unfolds. For decades, the UAE and its neighbors have built an image of invulnerability, positioning themselves as the glittering, stable financial hubs of the Middle East. Now, according to the text, Dubai is an active war zone, caught in the crossfire of this asymmetric warfare.
And the vulnerability of these states is not primarily military. It is a fundamental existential vulnerability related to their geography. The text zeroes in on a terrifying infrastructural reality. Between 70 and 90% of the potable water in the Gulf states is generated by desalination plants.
Which is a brilliant and horrifying point to extract. Desalination, specifically reverse osmosis on that scale, is incredibly energy intensive.
It requires massive power.
It requires a constant baseload of power.
Yeah.
If the energy grid in the Gulf is compromised, if power plants are targeted, or if the pipelines feeding them are severed in the chaos of the broader conflict, those desalination facilities go dark.
And the clock starts ticking immediately. These are populations of millions of people residing in hyper-arid desert environments. If the desalination plants shut down, they don't have months of reservoir reserves to rely on.
Yeah.
They have days. The societal collapse, the panic over a fundamental lack of drinking water would be immediate, absolute, and impossible to contain.
And the leaders of these Gulf states know this. They understand exactly how fragile their societies are. So according to the source, they aren't just sitting back hoping the U.S. wins quickly. They are leveraging their immense power to force an end to the conflict.
They have to.
The text mentions the immediate threat of domestic uprisings, citing imagery of Molotov cocktails in the streets of Bahrain, driven by the panic and destabilization.
To prevent that collapse, the Gulf leadership issues a dual ultimatum to Washington. The first lever is military. They tell the U.S. to halt the campaign immediately, or they will revoke basing rights.
Kick them out entirely.
They threaten to expel the entire U.S. military apparatus from the region, but the second lever is far more damaging to the core objectives of the U.S. administration.
The financial lever. The Gulf states control some of the largest sovereign wealth funds on the planet, heavily invested in U.S. treasuries and American equities. The source says they are threatening to liquidate those positions.
A mass sell-off.
They will dump U.S. assets onto the open market if a ceasefire isn't reached.
Which represents a supreme irony in this geopolitical narrative. The U.S. administration allegedly initiated this chain of events to protect the hegemony of the dollar and solve its debt crisis.
Right.
And the unintended consequence is that their closest regional allies are now threatening to trigger a massive sell-off of U.S. debt to force them to starve. The actions taken to save the financial system are precipitating its collapse.
And that collapse isn't contained to the Middle East. The source provides a vivid picture of the immediate contagion spreading through the global financial architecture. We aren't talking about a mild correction. We are talking about structural failures.
Blood in the streets.
The text points to international equities like the South Korean stock market dropping 30% in a matter of days.
And the contagion targets the most highly levered and vulnerable sectors first. The analysis highlights severe crashes in AI technology stocks and the broader private equity and private debt markets.
Why those sectors specifically? I understand oil spikes hurt the broader economy, but why is private equity taking the immediate hit in this scenario?
Because private equity is fundamentally built on leverage, cheap, predictable debt. When a geopolitical shock of this magnitude occurs, risk premiums skyrocket, liquidity dries up, and the cost of capital spikes.
So the math doesn't work anymore.
Those highly leveraged portfolios begin to unwind violently. As for the AI sector, those valuations are based on future growth that requires massive, uninterrupted energy consumption to power data centers. When global energy markets fracture, the fundamental growth thesis for AI is severely compromised.
But the financial pain on Wall Street is secondary to the physical crisis playing out in the commodities markets. It's not just the crude oil tanker traffic halted in the Strait of Hormuz. The source emphasizes the disruption of LNG, liquid natural gas.
Yes.
And LNG isn't just about keeping the lights on. It is a foundational block of global agriculture.
That is a crucial connection the text makes. The Haber-Bosch process, which produces the nitrogen fertilizer that sustains the global food supply, relies almost entirely on natural gas as a feedstock.
So no gas means no fertilizer.
If the flow of LNG from the Gulf is choked off, fertilizer production facilities worldwide are forced to shutter.
So the domino effect is terrifyingly rapid.
Yeah.
The geopolitical conflict in the Gulf halts natural gas exports, which stops fertilizer production, which guarantees massive crop yield failures in the next harvest cycle.
It's a direct line.
We're talking about a direct line from a missile strike in Bahrain to hyperinflation and physical food shortages at grocery stores across the globe.
And sitting squarely in the crosshairs of both the energy crisis and the resulting socioeconomic fallout is Europe. The source's assessment of the European continent in this scenario is incredibly grim.
Yeah.
Europe has spent the last several years systematically cutting itself off from Russian energy sources, leaving it heavily dependent on LNG imports from the U.S. and the Middle East.
So when the Strait of Hormuz closes, Europe faces an immediate crippling energy deficit. The industrial base in countries like Germany simply cannot operate at those spiked energy prices.
It just shuts down.
You're looking at the rapid, forced deindustrialization of the European economy. And on top of that economic devastation, the source points to a looming humanitarian crisis.
The text notes that the destabilization in the Middle East, compounded by potential food shortages in northern Africa, will inevitably trigger massive new streams of refugees.
Right.
Europe, already politically fractured and economically weakened, would face an unprecedented influx of displaced populations arriving at its borders.
The pressure of this multi-tiered crisis is causing the foundational alliances of the modern world to buckle. The source highlights a historic diplomatic rupture. We are seeing nations deeply embedded in the Western consensus, specifically citing the United Kingdom and Switzerland, openly declaring the actions of the United States to be illegal.
The significance of that detail cannot be overstated. When London and Bern publicly break with Washington on a matter of global security, it signifies the definitive death of the transatlantic alliance.
The end of an era.
That is the 80-year-old diplomatic architecture, built in the aftermath of World War II to present a unified Western front, entirely dissolved. The United States finds itself diplomatically marooned, standing virtually alone with Israel, while its oldest allies actively distance themselves from the fallout.
The source makes a chilling historical comparison here. He suggests the U.S. is acting with such unilateral aggression that it is forcing the rest of the world to unite against it, drawing a parallel to how the global community was forced to unite against rogue, expansionist powers in the 1940s.
A total role reversal.
It's a profound shift from being the guarantor of global security to being perceived as the primary threat to it. So with the global economy cratering, allies defecting, and military objectives failing in the Gulf, how does the source see this acute crisis resolving? What is the off-ramp?
The source's prediction is highly specific, and it circles back to the macroeconomic premise. Middlecoop argues that the U.S. political and economic system is fundamentally addicted to two things: cheap energy and artificially high equity markets.
Right. If you look at the domestic political reality in America, a president's viability is tied directly to the price of a gallon of gas and the health of the average citizen's retirement portfolio.
It's the only thing that matters.
If gas is $7 a gallon and 401ks are bleeding out 30% of their value, the domestic pressure becomes insurmountable.
Therefore, the source predicts that the ultimate break on this conflict won't come from a sudden moral reckoning in the White House, nor will it come from the Pentagon realizing the tactical error. The hard stop will come from Wall Street.
Wall Street steps in.
In the midst of this crisis, the CEOs of the major financial institutions are looking at the systemic unwinding of the global markets, and they are making panicked phone calls to the executive branch. They are delivering a blunt message. The U.S. economy is on the precipice of a collapse that will dwarf the 2008 financial crisis. You have to stop the war immediately.
So the administration is trapped. They need to end the war to save the markets, but they cannot admit defeat without suffering massive political humiliation domestically. So what is the play? The source predicts the deployment of a fake victory.
It is the ultimate cynical political maneuver. The text anticipates that the administration will simply step up to the podium, declare that all strategic objectives have been achieved, claim that Iran's military capabilities have been permanently degraded, and unilaterally announce a ceasefire.
They will declare victory and go home, purely to provide the psychological relief necessary to stabilize the financial markets. They just need the algorithmic trading bots to stop selling off equities.
Just to stop the bleeding.
But this is where the source drops a brilliant, profound warning. He quotes Winston Churchill. You might be the master of the decision to start the war, but you become the slave of the unintended consequences.
That quote perfectly encapsulates the flaw in the fake victory strategy. It assumes that the United States is still in complete control of the timeline, but Iran has agency in this scenario.
Right, they get a vote.
They have absorbed the kinetic strikes, their infrastructure has been damaged, and they have successfully deployed their asymmetric capabilities to cripple the U.S. presence. Why would they accept a unilateral ceasefire dictated by Washington just because Wall Street is panicking?
Exactly. Iran can look at the telemetry of the U.S. stock market and see the desperation. They can look at the depleted Patriot missile batteries. They can say, no, we don't accept your fake peace. We know you are economically bleeding out. If you want this to stop, we dictate the terms.
And the terms will be steep.
The source implies that Iran could demand massive, humiliating geopolitical concessions. Perhaps the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from specific regional bases or the lifting of all economic sanctions before they agree to halt their asymmetric attacks. The U.S. could find itself trapped in a war it desperately needs to exit, but the door is locked from the outside.
It leaves the United States in a position of acute vulnerability, both militarily and financially, having accelerated the exact multipolar transition it was trying to prevent.
This has been a breathtakingly dense and complex journey. We have covered an immense amount of theoretical ground today. Let's take a moment to distill the core architecture of this deep dive.
Sounds good.
We started with Willem Middlecoop's premise that the current global volatility isn't a series of unfortunate events, but the structural unraveling of an 80-year cycle, a fourth turning. driven by a $40 trillion U.S. sovereign debt crisis.
We examined how that financial desperation led a radically shifted, deeply ideological U.S. administration to abandon traditional diplomacy in favor of a flight forward, utilizing extreme tariffs and kinetic proxy warfare in the Middle East to ultimately sever China's energy lifeline and crush the BRICS movement toward de-dollarization.
We looked at the catastrophic tactical miscalculations of that kinetic war, mapping out how Iran's asymmetric swarm tactics dismantled the U.S. regional infrastructure, exposing the fragility of the Western defense industrial base.
And we tracked the massive collateral damage.
From the existential threat to the Gulf states' desalinated water supply, to the global shockwaves tearing through AI equities, private credit, and agricultural supply chains.
And ultimately, we analyzed the historic fracture of the post-WWII transatlantic alliance, leaving a globally isolated U.S. administration attempting to engineer a fake victory simply to appease a panicking Wall Street, only to find themselves hostage to the unintended consequences of the chaos they unleashed.
It is an overwhelming framework to process. But for you, the listener, why does mapping out this specific grim geopolitical theory matter? Why spend an hour understanding the mechanics of a doomsday scenario?
Because it forces you to understand the absolute interconnectedness of the modern world. The concepts we dissected today, the structural decay of sovereign debt, the vulnerability of extended supply chains, the mechanics of asymmetric warfare, these are not abstract theories confined to war colleges or central banks. No. They are the invisible forces that dictate the reality of your daily life. They determine the purchasing power of your savings, the viability of your investments, and the security of the commodities you rely on. When you understand how these macroeconomic and geopolitical gears interlock, you are no longer just passively consuming the chaotic daily news cycle. You acquire a lens that allows you to see the underlying architecture of global events.
It gives you the analytical tools to see the signal through the noise. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to turn over in your own mind. It builds directly on the source's theory of the flight forward, but looks at it from the perspective of the broader global audience.
Okay.
We spent a lot of time discussing how the source believes the United States is utilizing extreme financial extortion, the weaponization of tariffs, and kinetic proxy wars to force the world to remain shackled to the dollar system and abandon the BRICS alternative architecture. But consider the psychological impact of that strategy on the rest of the world. If you are watching the nation that controls the global reserve currency behave with this level of erratic aggression, if you are watching them freeze sovereign assets, sever global supply chains, alienate their oldest European allies, and trigger massive systemic inflation in food and energy markets to serve their domestic political needs, doesn't that fundamentally alter your risk calculus?
It would have to.
Ask yourself, if you were the leadership of a neutral nation in the global south, watching the chaotic, destructive fallout of this strategy, wouldn't you view the U.S. dollar not as a safe harbor, but as an intolerable geopolitical liability?
That's the real question.
Wouldn't Washington's aggressive actions actually serve to wildly accelerate the exact de-dollarization they are fighting a war to prevent, pushing the world to build an insulated alternative financial system faster and with more urgency than ever before?
It's definitely something to think about.
Thank you so much for exploring this incredibly complex map with us today. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking for the underlying mechanics, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.